Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you the new science fiction stories for you, and new adventure, new world here.
They came expecting livestock. They found something that had survived ice ages, plagues, and the slow violence of its own heart, and still had the audacity to laugh. That was the first mistake. The second was asking us to prove ourselves. The Varek had a word for the kind of creature that survived without deserving to. Gretval. It translated loosely as accidental persistence, the biological equivalent of a weed that sprouts through concrete, not because it's strong, but because it's too stupid to understand that the concrete one. The Varek used it for vermin, for bottom feeders, for the kind of organism that clings to existence through sheer, mindless, embarrassing tenacity rather than through any quality worth admiring. After first contact with humanity, the Varek senior xenobiologist, a woman named Commander Tessa Van Orlith, added the word to the official human classification file and thought nothing more of it. That file would later become the most annotated document in Varek military history. The Varek dominion stretched across 11 star systems and had been doing so for 400 years. They had not achieved this through diplomacy, particularly. They had achieved it the same way most things in the universe get achieved, through the organized application of force, executed with extraordinary precision by creatures built for exactly that purpose. The Varek were tall, nearly 3 meters, with a silhouette that looked like someone had taken the concept of a human woman, run it through a filter of pure function, and added a second set of arms. Their skin cycled through bioluminescent patterns when they were calm, when they were calculating, when they were bored, when they were angry, which was rare because anger cost energy, and the Varek were efficient. It went flat, matte black, like a light source that had simply decided to stop. Their warriors were female. This was not politics. This was biology. Varek females process combat neurochemistry at a rate that made their males look like they were moving through syrup. The males managed. They administered. They built. The females fought, and they did it with a kind of engineered grace that had ended 3 interstellar civilizations and brought 5 more to the table of negotiation before the first shot was fired. The Varek did not consider themselves cruel. They considered themselves correct. Humanity's first official communication with the Varek Dominion came through a probe relay on the edge of the Kuiper Belt, 17 years after Earth had cracked faster-than-light transit, and, for years after the first human settlement on Kepler, 452b collapsed due to what the colony report diplomatically called catastrophic ecological miscalculation, and what the surviving colonists called, "We didn't pack enough canned goods, and the fruit was trying to eat us back." The message was in 17 languages simultaneously. The Varek were efficient like that. It said, essentially, "We have noticed you. Submit a delegation. We will evaluate your species' eligibility for Dominion consideration. This is not optional." Earth's Unified Council spent 3 weeks arguing about it. Then, they sent Dr. Marin Vasquez. Marin Vasquez was 44 years old, from a small city in northern Mexico, and had spent the previous decade doing xenolinguistics research at the ESA's Contact Preparation Bureau, a department that had existed for 30 years and had, until that message arrived, been largely theoretical. She had 3 doctorates. She had a habit of cracking her knuckles when she was thinking that drove her colleagues into low-grade insanity. She had once, during a field linguistics expedition in Papua New Guinea, set her own dislocated shoulder using a stick and a strip of her jacket because the nearest hospital was 4 hours away, and she had data to collect. She was not, by any metric the Varek used, a warrior. She was the closest thing Earth had to one. They gave her a ship, a crew of 12, and a military attaché named Captain Deo Adeyemi, who was there, as the council privately briefed him, less to fight anything and more to stop Marin from saying something catastrophic. Deo was Nigerian-British, former Royal Marines, built like a question that hadn't finished forming yet, and had exactly the kind of face that makes you feel like he's already thought 3 steps past whatever you just said, and is being extremely polite about it. He spent the first 2 days of the voyage watching Marin read Varec linguistic structure files and eating the worst protein bars he'd ever encountered in 15 years of military service. "You're not worried?" he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up, cracked her knuckles. "Should I be? We're flying toward an 11-system empire that classifies us as accidental vermin. They classified us." She turned a page. "They bothered to create a category for us. That's not dismissal. That's anxiety management." Deo sat with that for a moment. "You're going to be extremely annoying to protect," he said. Marin smiled without looking up. "I know. The Varec station where the evaluation was to take place was called Dominion Processing Node 7, which told you everything about how the Varec felt about the civilizations cycling through it. It was not a welcoming place. It was a sorting machine. The kind of architecture that communicates, without a single word, that you are an item to be assessed, not a guest to be received. All vertical lines, and cold light sources, and corridors calibrated for beings 3 meters tall, which meant Marin and Deo and their crew spent the entire approach feeling like children navigating a building designed by adults who had never once been children themselves. They were met at the docking port by a Varec officer whose bioluminescent patterns were cycling in a slow, rhythmic gold. The xenolinguistics file identified that as polite condescension, which was apparently distinct from regular condescension in that it acknowledged your existence while still finding it faintly absurd. Her name was Subcommander Riva Thorel. She was by Varec standards relatively young, maybe 80 years old, which translated to something like mid-30s in metabolic experience. She had 4 arms. She used 2 of them to fold across her chest in a gesture the file noted as formal inspection stance, and 2 of them to hold a data tablet that she was consulting without looking up when they arrived. "Humans," she said. Not a greeting. A notation. "That's us," Marin said. Riva looked up. Her bioluminescent patterns stuttered. A micro-expression, barely perceptible, that the file identified as unexpected stimulus. She had been expecting, apparently, something more primitive-looking, something more Grethval. What she got was Marin Vasquez in a gray ESA field jacket, cracking her knuckles, looking back at her with the calm, interested expression of a scientist who has just found a new data point. "You are the delegation?" Riva said. +12, Marin said. "Dr. Marin Vasquez, Earth Unified Contact Bureau. This is Captain Adeyemi, our military liaison." She paused. "Though I should say, we don't really use the word military the way you do. He's more of a, what would you call it, Deo?" "Escort," Deo said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who has decided that the most powerful thing he can do in this moment is take up exactly the amount of space he occupies, and no more. Riva's patterns flickered again. Gold shifted towards something cooler, a blue-gray the file called recalibration. She studied Deo the way you study a structural reading that came back different than you expected. He was by the standards of species the Varec typically evaluated, not physically remarkable. Medium height for a human male. Lean rather than massive. No visible weapons because they'd been required to check everything at the dock. He looked back at her with absolutely nothing on his face. "Follow," Rivas said, and turned. They followed. The evaluation process, as Marin had prepared for it, was supposed to be primarily informational. The Varec would assess Earth's technological development, resource capacity, population distribution, conflict history. They would run the numbers. They would assign humanity a tier classification, somewhere between tributary civilization and elimination candidate, and that classification would determine everything that came after. What Marin had not fully prepared for, what no amount of linguistic files had quite conveyed, was the way the Varec women moved through their own station. The way space seemed to rearrange itself around them. The corridors were wide, but they filled them anyway, not through size, but through something more architectural, a quality of presence that wasn't aggression exactly, but was the readiness for it, carried so naturally it had become posture. These were beings who had been apex predators for so long that their bodies had simply stopped remembering there was any other option. The crew felt it. Marin watched them feeling it, The slight compression of shoulders, the shortened stride, the way Marco, their engineer, kept his eyes moving like he was clocking exits, even though he'd been explicitly told this was a diplomatic mission and there were no exits that mattered. "Stop doing that," she said quietly to him as they moved through a corridor junction. "Doing what?" "Looking like prey." Marco opened his mouth, closed it, took a breath, and deliberately widened his gaze, stopped the scanning, let his shoulders drop to their natural position. "Better," Marin said. Deo, walking on her other side, said nothing. He hadn't changed his posture once since they docked. The first session was in a chamber the Varek called the assessment hall, which was, Marin thought, looking around it, exactly what a civilization that had never doubted its own dominance would design as a room for evaluating lesser species. The ceiling was 4 stories up. The Varek panel sat elevated behind a long curved table that put them physically above anyone standing on the floor. There were 6 of them, all female, all in a matte dark uniform of the Dominion's Evaluation Directorate. The woman at the center was Commander Tessa Van Orlith, the xenobiologist, the one who had coined Grethval for humanity. She was older than Riva by at least 2 centuries. Her bioluminescent patterns had the particular depth of something that had been cycling for a very long time, colors bleeding into each other at the edges rather than running clean. She looked at the human delegation the way a geologist looks at a rock sample. Professional interest. No investment in the outcome. Earth delegation, she said. Her standard was flawless. The Varek had, apparently, spent their 17 years learning it while Earth had been arguing about whether to send a delegation at all. "You are aware of the Dominion evaluation process. We've reviewed the documentation you transmitted," Marin said. "Then you understand that this evaluation covers 3 domains. Resource viability, technological standing, combat capacity." Tessa Van paused. "Your first 2 assessments have already been conducted remotely. Your technological standing is classified as Tier 4, pre-integration, functional but primitive. Your resource viability is moderate. Your star system has more than you've learned to use." Another pause. "The 3rd assessment requires direct demonstration." Marin had known this was coming. She'd spent 6 months preparing for it. She still felt the specific, particular weight of the room pressing down when Tessa Van said it. "Combat capacity," Tessa Van continued, "will be assessed through direct engagement between our evaluation warriors and the designated combatants. Standard Dominion protocol. Non-lethal parameters, unless a combatant forfeits those parameters through their own actions." Her pattern stayed flat gold throughout. This was routine. They'd done this 400 times with 400 species. "You will designate 3 combatants. Our warriors will assess their capacity, their pain threshold, their tactical adaptation under duress. The result will determine your tier classification in the combat domain, which will determine your integration status." She looked at Marin. "Do you understand?" Marin said, "Can I ask the question first?" The patterns flickered across the entire panel. Marin had a feeling that wasn't a common opening. "You may," Tessa Van said. "How many species have passed the combat assessment?" Silence. Not the polite kind. The kind that has a shape. Tessa Van's patterns shifted to something Marin didn't have a file entry for, something that looked like it might be the Varek equivalent of a person deciding whether to answer a question honestly or charitably. 7, Tessa Van said finally. "In 400 years of evaluation, 7 species have been classified at combat tier 3 or above. What happened to the others?" "They were classified accurately," Tessa Van said, "and integrated accordingly." Marin nodded slowly. Crack her knuckles, once quietly. "All right," she said. "We'll need 30 minutes to confer." Tessa Van looked mildly surprised. Most delegations, apparently, needed longer than that to process the information they'd just been given, or they immediately began negotiating for exemptions, or they cried. The file probably had a section on it. 30 minutes, Tessa Van confirmed. "Subcommander Thorl will escort you to the deliberation room." The deliberation room was smaller. Human proportioned, almost, or maybe it just felt that way because it didn't have a ceiling designed to make you feel like an insect. Riva stood at the door. Not listening, presumably. Or listening and not caring, because what could they possibly say that would matter? Marin spread the crew assessment files across the table from memory. Okay, 3 combatants. I'll go, Deo said. Obviously, Marin said. Who else? Lieutenant Okafor, Deo said immediately. And Sergeant Chun. Marin looked at him. Lieutenant Adiz Okafor was 26 years old and had, before joining the mission crew, competed in the World Judo Championships. She was also, Marin happened to know, the person who had arm wrestled Marco for the last ration pack during a supply delay on the outbound journey, and once so quickly that Marco had genuinely questioned whether the arm wrestling had actually happened. Sergeant Yui Chun had spent 8 years in the JSDF and had, on a previous mission to the Kepler settlement, carried an injured colonist 14 kilometers through hostile terrain with a fractured fibula because the extraction shuttle couldn't land any closer and no one else was strong enough to do it. When asked afterward if it had been painful, she'd looked at the interviewer with an expression of such complete incomprehension that the interviewer had quietly moved on. They're going to fight Varek warriors, Marin said. Yes, Deo said. Varek warriors who have been doing this for centuries. Yes. And your reasoning is, Deo looked at her. My reasoning is that they're ours. A small silence. They know what they're signing up for. Marin asked. I'll ask them. He stepped out. Came back in 4 minutes. They said yes. What exactly did they say? A pause. Adiz said, and I'm quoting, about time, and Yui said, Marin stared at him. Yui Chan said, okay, she repeated. She also finished her protein bar first, Deo said, which I think tells you something. Marin sat with that for a moment. Then she cracked her knuckles and stood up. All right, she said, let's go tell the Varek they have their fight. She did not say, I hope we're not making a catastrophic mistake. She didn't need to. The thought was already in the room, taking up space, being politely ignored by everyone present. That, Marin thought, was probably the most human thing about all of them. What none of them said, what none of them could say without the words falling apart before they reached the air, was that every single one of them had already decided not to win. That was too simple, too clean, too much like a plan with a guaranteed outcome. They had decided to not break. Whatever happened in that assessment chamber, whatever the Varek warriors brought, whatever pain threshold they tested, whatever they expected to find and find lacking, they were going to hold the line not because they knew they could, but because the alternative was letting something much larger than this delegation be decided in a room 4 light years from home. Marin thought about this as Riva led them back down the corridor toward the assessment hall. She thought about Greth Val, accidental persistence, weed through concrete. She thought, you have no idea how the weed sees the concrete. The assessment hall, doors opened. The Varek evaluation warriors were already waiting. And the moment Deo Adeyemi saw them, really saw them, not through a file, not through a briefing, but with his actual eyes in the actual room, he understood with complete clarity exactly what humanity was up against. He took a breath, let out slow, and walked it anyway. The 3 Varek evaluation warriors standing at the far end of the assessment hall were not trying to be intimidating. That was somehow the most intimidating thing about them. They stood in a loose, triangle formation with the particular stillness of beings that have no relationship with nervous energy. No fidgeting, no weight shifting, no micro-expressions bleeding through at the edges. They were simply present the way a mountain is present, not threatening the landscape. Just there, in it unmovable by any force that the landscape could reasonably produce. The tallest was nearly 3.5 meters. Her bioluminescent patterns were running in a deep, slow crimson. Not anger, not tension, but something the file called combat readiness state, which was apparently a Varek physiological baseline before engagement, and not an emotion at all. It was the color of a system switching on. The color of something that has been built for one purpose, settling into that purpose the way a key settles into a lock. The one on the left was slightly shorter, her upper left arm wrapped in what looked like the Varek equivalent of a championship band, dense, dark material embossed with geometric symbols Marin's file, identified as victory markers. She had, the file would later indicate, fought in 32 assessment engagements across 9 species. She had never been brought below combat functional status. Not once. Not by anything. The third was the youngest, by Varric standards, relatively speaking, which meant she was probably 40 years old and had been training since she could walk and had the particular quality of someone who's been so thoroughly prepared for something that the thing itself has stopped being a question. Deo stood beside Marin and did not say anything. He was doing math. She could tell. Not the kind with numbers, the kind with bodies, distances, weight distributions, the geometry of what happens when 3 meters of engineered combat physiology closes the space between itself and a human being. He was doing the math and arriving at the same answer every time. He kept doing it anyway. Tessa Van spoke from the elevated panel. The engagement parameters are as follows. 3 rounds. Each round involves 1 Varric evaluator against 1 human combatant. The evaluator will assess pain threshold, tactical adaptation, endurance under duress, and recovery speed. Non-lethal directive is active. An engagement ends when a combatant is incapacitated or forfeits. She paused. Forfeiture is not penalized. It is noted in the assessment as data. That last part, Marin recognized, was the Varric version of mercy. You can quit, and we'll just write it down. No shame. Just a number. She watched Deo register it. She watched him decide it wasn't relevant. Round 1, Tessa Van said. First human combatant. Evaluation warrior Sin. The tallest 1 step forward. Deo turned to Adiz. Adiz was already rolling her neck. She was wearing the same gray mission uniform as everyone else. No special gear. No anything. They hadn't brought anything because nobody had thought to ask the Varric if they could bring anything, because nobody on Earth had quite believed this moment would be this literal until they were standing in it. She looked at Sen. She looked back at Deo. Height, she said. Disadvantage. Reach. Significant disadvantage. Massachusetts. Don't do the math on mass, Deo said quietly. Adiz almost smiled. Center of gravity? She's carrying mass in the upper body with those second arms. Her base will be narrower than you expect for the height. She'll be harder to topple, but her recovery from a lateral off balance might be interesting. Adiz finished. I was going to say exploitable. Same thing. Adiz stepped forward. What the Varric expected when the small human female walked towards Sin was a demonstration of the standard species gap phenomenon. They had seen it 400 times. The smaller, softer, less adapted species enters the space of the evaluator. They try something. The evaluator responds. The species discovers in real time and in their own body what it means to encounter something genuinely built for this. Most species took 2 to 3 exchanges before forfeiture. The data was useful. The outcome was always the same. Adiz Okafor weighed 63 kilos. Sen weighed somewhere north of 400. Adiz closed the distance at a pace that Marin watched Subcommander Reva clock. A micro-expression flicker. That recalibration blue-gray again. She'd expected slower. Most species slowed as they approached. Everything that has ever been prey knows, on some cellular level, to give ground. Adiz walked toward a 3.5 meter alien warrior like she was walking toward a problem she'd already solved and just needed to finish writing up. The exchange that followed lasted 47 seconds. It is difficult to describe 47 seconds accurately when those seconds contain that much information moving that fast. But here is the shape of it. Sen reached. Adiz wasn't there. Sen adjusted with the efficiency of something that has never missed the same adjustment twice. And this time her upper right arm connected. And it connected like a door, closing, heavy, and final. And Adiz went down. The assessment hall was silent. She hit the floor, rolled, not away from Sin, which is what instinct suggests, but into the momentum underneath the recovery arc of the arm that had just hit her in the 1/2 second window where Sin's weight was committed to the follow-through, and her base was exactly as exploitable as Deo had said it might be. Adiz got her hands on Sin's lower leg. What happened next was everyone in the room agreed, later across 3 separate debrief files. Not something they had a framework for. She didn't throw Sen. That would have been impossible, and everyone knew it. She redirected her. The distinction matters. It's the difference between trying to stop a river and learning exactly where the river wants to go and getting very slightly out of the way while exerting the minimum necessary force at the maximum necessary moment. Sen went sideways. Not far. Not enough to matter in absolute terms. But enough for one fraction of a second that her base was wrong and her recovery was committed, and Adiz had already moved through the space that Sen's recovery was going to need. She got Sen's second left arm in a joint lock that every single person watching, human and Varek alike, understood was pointing at a threshold. Sen went still. The silence in the assessment hall had a texture now. It was the silence of a room that has encountered a variable it didn't account for and is recalculating. Adiz held the lock for 3 full seconds, enough to make the point, not enough to cause damage. Then she let go, stepped back, stood. She had a bruise forming along her entire left side that was going to be spectacular by morning. She was breathing harder than normal. Her hands, Marin noticed, had a slight tremor that she was controlling by keeping them loose at her sides. She did not show any of it. Tessa Van said, from the panel, "Hold. A pause. Score this round," she said to the assessor beside her. The assessor looked at her screen for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, given that they'd presumably done this hundreds of times, and the interface shouldn't require extended reading. Evaluator Sen, the assessor said carefully, reached control threshold. A pause. Human combatant achieved a compliance position on the evaluator prior to forfeiture. The room absorbed this. Compliance position. Asterisk Varek terminology. It meant the smaller combatant had gotten the larger combatant into a position where continued resistance would have caused damage. It meant, in a real engagement, that moment had meaning. In 400 years of evaluation, across hundreds of assessed species, no non-Tier 3 species had achieved a compliance position on a Varek evaluation warrior in round 1. Riva's bioluminescent patterns had gone fully to that recalibration blue. She was staring at Adiz Okafor. Adiz was standing with her arms loose at her sides, still controlling the tremor in her hands, looking back with an expression that was not triumph. There was no performance in it, nothing for the audience. It was the expression of someone who has done the thing they came to do and is now quietly assessing what it cost. Deo was watching her too. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Round 2 was Yui Chun against the second evaluator, the one with the 32 victory markers. Her name was Assessor Warrior Dahl. Dahl watched Yui walk to the center of the assessment hall with the particular attention of someone who has just watched the previous round and is now recalibrating every assumption she came in with. Her patterns were running a color that wasn't in Marin's file. Something between gold and white, rapid and irregular. Marin leaned toward Deo. "What does that color mean?" "I don't know," he said quietly. That, Marin thought, might be the most important sentence spoken today. Yui Chun was 5'4". She had a face that gave away approximately nothing and a posture that was so relaxed it read, from a distance, as indifference. It was not indifference. Marin had known Yui for 4 years and could confirm. Yui was the least indifferent person she had ever met. She was simply so completely settled in her own body that she didn't require external signals to communicate her state. Dahl approached. Yui let her. The first exchange, Dahl hit her twice in quick succession, controlled evaluative hits not designed to end anything but to map pain response and recovery speed. Standard assessment protocol. The data from a target's first response to pain told you almost everything. Yui's pain response was, she absorbed both hits, shifted her weight, and came back in. Dahl hit her a third time. Harder. Still controlled, but harder, pushing the threshold, looking for the number where the target's nervous system says no more. Yui came back in. Dahl stood absolutely still for 0.8 seconds. In Varek combat physiology, 0.8 seconds of absolute stillness during an active engagement is the equivalent of a very loud noise. It is the processing pause of a system that has encountered data it doesn't know where to file. Marin watched Tessa Van, up on the panel, put down her tablet. Dahl resumed. She shifted her approach, stopped mapping, started testing endurance. It became less an assessment and more a sustained pressure, escalating and methodical, the kind of engagement designed not to break a target at a single point, but to find the aggregate limit, the place where the sum of accumulated damage produces a threshold crossing. 2 minutes. 3. Yui was bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow. Her left arm was moving wrong. Not broken, but the shoulder had taken something it was going to remember. She was breathing the way a person breathes when breathing has become work. She did not go to her knees. At the 4-minute mark, something shifted. It wasn't tactical. It wasn't a technique or a hold or an approach. It was more fundamental than that. And it was the thing that Marin had been trying to explain to the council for 3 years when they asked her what humanity would bring to an evaluation like this. And she'd never quite found the language for it. And now she was watching it in real time and still wasn't sure she had the language, but here was the shape of it. Yui-chan had a place she went. Not physically, not tactically, somewhere interior, and she went there the way some people go to a room in their house that is theirs and nobody else's, and from there she was no longer fighting against anything. She was just continuing in the specific, durable, slightly irrational way that humans continue past the point where continuance has stopped making sense. Dahl could feel it. You could see it in her patterns. That rapid, gold-white, flickering going slower, more uncertain, like a calculation that keeps producing the same wrong answer. She escalated again. Yui went down. Got up. Dahl hit her harder. There were 40 seconds of the most brutal Verek combat assessment technique in the file. A sustained pressure sequence that Marin's briefing notes had described as typically terminal to engagement for any sub-tier 3 combatant. Yui went down twice more. Got up twice more. On the second recovery, she was bleeding in 3 places, and her left arm was functionally out, and she was moving at maybe 60% of her opening capacity. She got up. She looked at Dahl. She said in Japanese something that Marin's translation ship rendered as asterisk, "I'm not done yet." Asterisk, it was not bravado. It was not performance. It was said with the same flat, matter-of-fact quality that she'd said okay in the deliberation room. The quality of someone reporting a fact. Dahl stopped. Not a tactical stop. Not a positioning pause. She stopped the way a person stops when they need a moment. Her patterns had gone to a color that Marin absolutely did not have a file entry for. She looked at Yui-chan, bleeding, shoulder compromised, getting ready to come forward again. And something moved through her patterns that Marin, watching from across the hall, could not name but could feel the weight of. Then, Dahl said something in Verek. Riva translated quietly from beside Marin. Her voice had a texture it hadn't had an hour ago. She said, "Why do you keep getting up?" Marin looked at Yui. Yui was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, in the Verek trade language, slowly and carefully because she'd clearly been practicing it for exactly this kind of moment. "Because I'm not finished. Not because I have to. Not because I'm trained to. Not because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't. Because I'm not finished." Asterisk, the assessment hall was silent for a long time. Deo was the last one. His opponent was the third evaluator, the young one. Her name was not in the file Marin had. She was introduced simply as Evaluator Third Tier Candidate, which meant she was in her own evaluation, being assessed for promotion through her performance against the human delegation. Her patterns were a clean, rapid silver. Not fear, not arrogance. Hunger, maybe, a very pure kind. She and Deo stood in the center of the hall. She was a full meter taller than him. Her reach was extraordinary. Her reflexes, based on what Marin had watched in the previous 2 rounds, were going to be faster than anything Deo had encountered in 15 years of service. He knew all of this. He stood in front of her anyway with that quality he had. Not stillness exactly, something more deliberate than stillness, like a person who has looked at the fulsome of a situation and decided to be exactly as large as they are and not apologize for it. The evaluator looked at him. He looked back. She said something in Verek. Riva translated. She's asking why a species this fragile has warriors at all. Marin watched Deo's face. He said, in the trade language, he'd apparently also been practicing. We're not warriors because we're strong. A pause. We're warriors because we're afraid of what we'd do if we stopped. The evaluator processed this. Her patterns did something Marin had now seen twice today. That rapid, filing error flickering. A system encountering data it doesn't have a category for. She attacked. What followed was the longest engagement of the three. Not because Deo matched her. He didn't. Not in the ways the previous 2 rounds had defined matching. He wasn't redirecting her. He wasn't finding the compliance window. He was doing something different, something that Marin, watching, eventually identified as the thing Deo had been doing since they docked at this station. He was surviving. Deliberately. Methodically. With a complete and utter refusal to stop. He took hits that should have ended it. He went down twice. He got up both times. He adapted in real time. Every time the evaluator changed her approach. Not perfectly, not with any kind of elegant efficiency, but with the grinding, iterative, slightly furious adaptation of something that has decided the available options do not include stop. 6 minutes in, he was compromised in both hands and had a rib that was sending very clear messages about the direction things were heading. He found a compliance position on her. Not through technique. Through the specific irrational stubbornness of a person who has been looking for a 30-second window for 6 minutes and has not stopped looking, not once, not even while the rest of him was occupied with not going down. He held it, then let go, stepped back and stood, breathing like a man who has just had an argument with gravity and won on a technicality. The evaluator looked at him for a long moment. Then she bowed. Not the Varek diplomatic acknowledgement bow. Marin knew that one from the files. This was something else. Shorter. More direct. The gesture of one warrior to another. Stripped of ceremony. Carrying nothing except what it was. Deo inclined his head. Up on the panel, Tessavan had not moved in 4 minutes. Her bioluminescent patterns were running a color that Marin had never seen in any file on any species. Something between silver and deep red, slow and absolute, and very, very old looking. Marin would later spend 3 months trying to find a cultural translation for that color. The closest she found, in an obscure Varek philosophical text from 600 years ago, was a phrase that translated roughly as, the moment of revising a belief you were certain would never require revision. Tessavan looked at the human delegation, at Adiz with her magnificent bruise, at Yui bleeding quietly and still upright, at Deo with his compromised hands and his unbent spine. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said quietly to the assessor beside her, "Reclassify." The assessor looked up. "Commander, reclassify the human combat tier assessment." A pause. "And flag this file for the full Dominion review." The assessor's patterns flickered. "What tier shall I don't know yet," Tessavan said. And for the first time in 400 years of sitting in this chair, running this evaluation, classifying 400 species with the calm and efficient certainty of someone who has never encountered a number she couldn't place. That was the truth. She didn't know. The file was still open. The humans were still standing. And everything the Dominion thought it understood about the distance between a species that survives and a species that chooses to had just become a question. The infirmary on Dominion Processing Node 7 was not designed for human anatomy. This was the kind of problem that reveals itself in small, specific ways. The examination beds were calibrated for a being 3 meters tall, which meant Adiz lay on one like a child in a hospital built for giants, her feet a full half-meter from the end. The lighting was optimized for Varek visual spectrum, which ran cooler and bluer than human preference, and gave everyone in the room the particular pallor of people photographed somewhere they weren't supposed to be. The medical personnel moved through the space with the same composed efficiency as everyone else on the station, but they had, Marin noticed, paused in their work twice already to look at the 3 human patients in ways that she was increasingly certain were not clinical. Adiz's bruise had achieved the spectacular trajectory Marin had predicted. It ran from her left shoulder to mid-rib cage in a wash of deep purple red that the Varek medic examined with what appeared to be genuine scientific fascination. "No fractures," the medic said. Her standard was functional, clinical, stripped of anything decorative. The tissue damage is significant for your species' baseline density. You should not have continued after the second impact. Noted Adiz said. It is not a recommendation, the medic said. It is an observation. Your pain receptor response suggested you were at the voluntary threshold. You continued anyway. Also noted. The medic looked at her for a moment with those patterns cycling in the slow, slightly puzzled blue that Marin was starting to think of as the Varex's default expression when dealing with humanity. Why? The medic asked. It was a genuine question. Not accusatory. Not challenging. The specific, pure curiosity of a scientist whose model of a thing has just produced a result outside the predicted range and wants to understand the mechanism. Adiz thought about it for a second. I have more to give, she said. At the level of damage you'd sustained, more than the damage, Adiz said. I had more of me to give. The damage is, that's just the housing. She gestured vaguely at her own body, the bruise, the shallow cut being sealed by the medic's equipment. The housing was complaining. I wasn't done. The medic was quiet for a long moment. Then, she went back to the repair work, but her patterns were running something Marin had no file entry for, cycling slowly, and she checked Adiz's injury 3 additional times beyond what the procedure technically required. Deo sat on the edge of his examination bed with his hands in his lap, while a second medic ran a regenerative wrap around both of them, and said nothing for a long time. Marin sat on a low bench against the wall, the only furniture in the room calibrated for her height, apparently brought in as an afterthought, and watched him. How bad? She asked. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 10 days if the wrap does what they say it does. The rib is manageable. He flexed his fingers experimentally inside the wrap. Adiz, fine. Spectacular bruise, no fractures. Yui. Marin looked across the room where Yui sat, very straight, on another oversized bed, while a medic worked on the cut above her eyebrow with what appeared to be something considerably more advanced than anything Earth's military medicine could offer. Yui was eating a protein bar. Not because she was hungry, probably, because eating was a normal thing, and she was a person who, when nothing else is available, makes normal things happen by sheer intention. Yui's fine, Marin said. Deo nodded. The evaluator bowed, he said. I saw. In 18 months of mission prep, nobody mentioned they could do that. The bow. The files don't have it. The files were built on prior species assessments, Marin said. No prior species produced a moment that required it. A silence. Tessa Van asked for a reclassification, Marin said. Deo looked at her. She doesn't know what tier to assign us, Marin said. She said she doesn't know. In 40 years of doing this job, Deo was quiet for a moment. Then, what does that mean for us? Practically, it means the evaluation isn't over, Marin said. It means the next step is a full Dominion review, which means this goes above Tessa Van's authority level, which means people with significantly more power than a processing node commander are going to be looking at our file. She paused, which is either the best thing that could have happened or the worst. Any read on which? Marin thought about the color of Tessa Van's patterns in the last minutes of the assessment. That slow, absolute, deep historical color she'd tracked down in a philosophical text. The color of revising a belief you were certain would never require revision. I think, she said carefully, that we made an impression. Deo looked at his wrapped hands. At some cost, he said. Everything costs something, Marin said. The question is whether it was worth it. Deo didn't answer for a moment. Then, ask me in a week. From across the room, without looking up from her protein bar, Yui said, worth it. Deo almost smiled. Sub-Commander Riva Thorel came to the infirmary at the 4th hour. She came alone, without the data tablet, without the gold condescension patterns. She stood in the doorway for a moment in a way that Marin, watching her, recognized as the posture of someone who has come to do something they weren't assigned to do and are still working out the exact shape of it. Sub-Commander, Marin said. Riva came in. She looked at the 3 patients. She looked at them the way the medic had, not clinically, but with that deep, slightly undefended curiosity that had replaced the polished condescension at some point during the assessment that Marin couldn't precisely locate. somewhere between a D's compliance position and Yui saying, "I'm not finished." "I wanted to inform you," Rivas said, "that Commander Tessavan has transmitted the reclassification request to Dominion High Assessment. The full review will begin in 3 days." She paused. "You're guests of the Dominion during this period, not subjects under evaluation protocol. Your status has been adjusted." "Meaning?" Marin asked. "Meaning you are not contained. You may move freely within the station. You will be provided standard Dominion guest accommodation, which will be adjusted for your specifications." Another pause. "I have already requested furniture calibrated to your scale." Marin looked at her. There was something else. Marin had been doing languages for 20 years, and she knew the structure of a person who has something else to say. Riva's pattern cycled. Blue-gray, that recalibration color. And under it something warmer, less categorized. "The evaluator who faced your third combatant," Rivas said. "Candidate evaluator third tier." She filed a supplementary note to the assessment record. What did it say? Riva was quiet for a moment. She said, Rivas stopped. Started again. "The translation is imprecise. The Varric term she used has no exact standard equivalent. It describes a quality observed in a combatant that the observer's own training has no framework for, something that falls outside the mapped categories of strength, technique, endurance, or strategy. A quality that is adjacent to all of them but not contained by any of them." Marin waited. "She described your combatants as having this quality," Rivas said. "All 3 of them. In different forms but the same root." A pause. She said it was the first time in her evaluation career she had encountered it. And she wanted it in the record because she believed the Dominion's assessment framework would need to be updated to account for it. A silence. "Did she give it a name?" Marin asked. "This quality?" Riva's patterns shifted. Something Marin had not seen before on her. Specifically, something that looked in structure and movement like it might be the Varric equivalent of someone choosing their words with unexpected care. The word she used, Rivas said slowly, is an old Varric term. Pre-Dominion. It has not been used in formal documentation in approximately 2 centuries. She paused. It translates, approximately, as chosen weight, the decision to carry something beyond the point where carrying is rational. Not because you cannot put it down, because you have decided it is worth carrying. The infirmary was quiet. Adiz was looking at the ceiling. Yui had finished her protein bar. Deo's hand was still in his lap, wrapped, and he was looking at Riva with that particular flatness that was, Marin had long ago realized, not absence but depth, too much in there to let any of it easily surface. "Thank you," Marin said, "for telling us." Riva nodded. Once. The gesture of someone doing something outside protocol and not apologizing for it. She left. The Dominion High Assessment Review took 11 days. Marin spent most of them in exactly the kind of work she'd come here to do. Conversations with Varric administrators, cultural exchange sessions that began with extreme formality and loosened incrementally as both sides discovered that the thing they'd each expected from the other was not, in fact, the whole truth of it. She spent 6 hours in a room with Tessa Van Orlith, who turned out, outside the assessment hall, outside the formalities of evaluation protocol, to be a scientist in the same way Marin was a scientist. The kind of person for whom a question that doesn't have an answer is more interesting than one that does. They did not become friends, but they became something that would, over time, become a word. The review board's decision came on the morning of the 12th day. It arrived as a formal transmission to Marin's delegation communication system, in 17 languages simultaneously, which she now understood was not the Varric's version of thoroughness, but of courtesy, the implicit acknowledgement that the receiving party's language mattered enough to be included. She read it twice. Then, she went to find Deo. He was in the guest quarters that Riva had arranged. Furniture calibrated to human scale, lighting adjusted toward the warmer end of spectrum, a small, inexplicable potted plant in the corner that none of them had requested and none of them commented on, but that Yui had quietly watered twice. He was doing the particular kind of slow, careful physical therapy that a person does when they have damaged hands and need them back and are willing to be methodical about it. The review board decision came, Marin said. He looked up. They classified us at Combat Assessment Tier 3, she said. Full Dominion integration consideration. Diplomatic standing, resource access, the whole framework. A pause. There's a note attached to the tier classification, she said. Filed by the board chair. She looked at the document in her hand. It says, Asterisk humanity is classified at Tier 3 on the basis of demonstrated combat capacity. However, the board notes that the standard combat tier framework does not adequately capture the species characteristic most relevant to Dominion strategic assessment. It is recommended that a new classification subcategory be developed specifically to account for this characteristic, which has no precedent in existing Dominion evaluation history. Asterisk Deo was quiet. They're creating a new category, he said. Apparently. For us. For what we did in that room, yes. She put the document down. The subcategory is tentatively titled, using that old Varec term Riva told us about. Chosen weight. She looked at him. They're not sure what to do with us. Not in a bad way. In the way that you're not sure what to do with a variable that keeps producing results your framework wasn't designed to predict. Deo sat with this for a moment. How does Earth's Council take news like this? He asked. Depends on the council member, Marin said. About half of them will be thrilled. The other half will be terrified by the same information. And you? Marin looked out the viewport at the station around them. This enormous, ancient, efficient machine of a civilization, built on 4 centuries of certainty, now quietly updating a category it had never needed to update before. I'm thinking about Grethval, she said. Deo waited. That's what they called us, she said. In the initial classification file. Accidental persistence. A weed through concrete. She paused. What I keep thinking about is, they weren't wrong exactly. We are persistent in a way that doesn't make rational sense from the outside. We do keep going past the point where stopping would be the logical choice. She turned from the viewport. They just misread the cause. They thought it was accident. Mindlessness. The weed doesn't know the concrete is there. Deo said nothing. He was listening in the way he listened, completely without performing it. But we know the concrete is there, Marin said. We've always known. We walk toward it anyway. Not because we don't understand what it is. Because we've decided something is worth more than the concrete opinion of our chances. A silence. That's chosen weight, Deo said. That's chosen weight, Marin said. On the last morning before departure, Tessa Van Orlith came to see them off. She brought Riva and the 3 evaluation warriors, Sin, Dahl, and the young third-tier candidate, whose name Marin had finally learned was Vane. She stood in the docking corridor with that deep, ancient color pattern cycling slowly, and she looked at Marin and the delegation with the specific expression of a person who has spent 400 years being certain about something and is now, for the first time, genuinely curious about where that certainty got revised. The review board's recommendation will take time to implement, Tessa Van said. The new subcategory, the updated framework. She paused. It is not a small thing. Dominion classification structures have not been amended in 60 years. I understand, Marin said. You should also understand, Tessa Van stopped. Started again. It was, Marin thought, only the second time she'd seen her stop and start. The first had been in the infirmary session, when she'd said, I don't know. There are species the Dominion has encountered that we feared because they were stronger, faster, more resilient in measurable physical terms. She paused. There are species we feared because they were more numerous, or more technologically advanced, or because the cost of engaging them exceeded any calculable benefit. She looked at Marin steadily. You are none of those things. A pause that had weight in it. And yet Tessa Van said, when I watch your 3 people in that hall, I felt something I have not felt in 200 years of evaluation work. Something I did not expect to feel and have been attempting to accurately categorize since. She paused again. I believe the closest approximation in standard is concern, not threat assessment. Not strategic anxiety. Concern. The specific, slightly personal weight of a person who has looked at something clearly and understood that the thing they're looking at is going to matter in ways they cannot yet fully predict. Marin held that for a moment. Then, she said, "We're not your enemy." "No," Tessavan said. "I know that." A pause. "That is precisely what makes the concern interesting." A small silence. Then, Tessavan did something that Riva, later, in a supplementary note to the diplomatic record, described as having no precedent in her 10 years serving under the commander's command. She extended one of her upper hands. Not the Varek diplomatic acknowledgement gesture. Not any formal protocol Marin had a file entry for. A hand. Extended. Marin looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. The shake was slightly off, different joint structures, different default grip pressure, but they held it for a full 3 seconds, and neither of them let go before the other. "Safe passage, Dr. Vasquez," Tessavan said. "Thank you, Commander," Marin said, "for revising your file." Something moved through Tessavan's patterns. That silver red, that ancient revisionary color one last time. "It will not be the last revision," she said, and it sounded less like a warning than an acknowledgement, less like a threat than a promise. The ship cleared the station's transit corridor and dropped into the quiet between stars. Marin stood at the observation port and watched the Dominion's node shrink to a point of light and then stop being visible at all and then become indistinguishable from everything else out there, all those other points of light, each of them containing something enormous and old and certain of itself and waiting without knowing it for the variable that would require a new category. Behind her, the crew settled into the rhythms of a return voyage. Someone put on music. Marco discovered that the Varek medical supplies included a compound that worked remarkably well on protein bar-related despair. Adiz was asleep with a magnificent bruise fading toward a slightly less spectacular yellow-green. Yui was reading. Deo sat in the co-pilot seat with his healing hands and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "When we get back, what do you tell them?" "The Council. All of them. Earth. Everyone." Marin thought about this. She thought about Grethval and Chosen Weight and a room built to make species feel small and 3 human beings who had stood in it and declined on a cellular level to be diminished. She thought about Tessavan's patterns going that ancient, revising color. She thought about Evaluator Vane, 20-something years old, already 32 victories, pattern in that uncertain gold-white, bowing to Deo Adeyemi with a gesture so stripped of ceremony it was nothing but what it was. She thought about what it means to be a species that has survived ice ages and plagues and the accumulated weight of our own worst impulses and somehow carries the thing forward. Not because we don't know how heavy it is, but because we've decided every generation that it's worth carrying. "I tell them," Marin said, "that the most powerful civilization in 11-star systems needed to create a new category to put us in." She paused. "And then, I tell them that we're the only species in 400 years of Dominion evaluation history to be in it." Deo was quiet. And then Marin said, "I tell them to not let it go to their heads. Because the Varek are going to be watching very carefully from now on. And everything we do from this moment is going to be data." "In the file," Deo said. "In the file," Marin said. A silence. "Think I'll be worried?" he asked. "The Council. Some of them," she said. "The ones who understand what this actually means. The ones who know that being noticed by an 11-system empire is not a neutral event. The ones who understand that we just earned something that has a cost, and the cost hasn't started showing up yet." She looked at the stars. "The others," she said, "are going to want to make a speech about it." Deo almost smiled. Then, "And you?" Marin thought about Tessavan's hand in hers. The off angle of it. The 3 full seconds. "I'm going to write the best xenolinguistic analysis of Vera communication patterns ever produced," she said. "And then I'm going to go home. And then I'm going to eat something that isn't a protein bar." A pause. "In that order?" Deo laughed. A real one. Short, tired, genuine. The laugh of a man who has been holding something for a long time and can, just for a moment, put it down. Outside the viewport, the stars held their positions. Ancient, enormous, indifferent to everything. Except, here and there, in the dark between them, something was updating its files. Something old and certain and unrevised for centuries was running new calculations, asking new questions, trying to find the right category for a species that kept getting up, for a species that knew exactly how heavy the concrete was and walked toward it anyway, for a species that had looked at the full cold arithmetic of the universe, all that darkness, all those stars that didn't care, all that silence where God should have been, and responded in its inimitable, irrational, ever-loving way. We're not finished yet. Asterisk somewhere in Dominion High Assessment, in a file that now carried 6 different classification flags. A senior archivist added a final notation at the bottom of the human combat evaluation record. Asterisk the notation read asterisk species. Displays consistent pattern of exceeding calculated biological limitations under conditions of sustained duress. Mechanism unknown. Recommend ongoing monitoring. Recommend extreme caution in adversarial engagement. Recommend, most urgently, that we do not make them our enemy. Asterisk then, the archivist paused. Asterisk added one more line. Asterisk also recommend, consider what it means that the most dangerous thing about them is not what they can do to us. It is what they are willing to do to themselves, and keep doing in service of something they have decided matters. Asterisk the file was marked. Open. Asterisk as it would remain, probably, for a very long time. Asterisk.